What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
Two book nerds who have to record an entire podcast episode just to resolve their feelings about a very complicated book. And we would love to be your book friend.
This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
This week, we're reading Whale by Cheon Myeong-Kwan and brilliantly translated by Cheon Kim. This is a Korean contemporary classic novel about 3 generations of women's misfortunes, told in a kind of folktale oral narration style. And a lot of gross things happen.
Yeah. So a brief content warning up top. This book deals with a lot of difficult subjects and includes a lot of body horror. In our discussion today, we might reference plot points that include rape and murder and misogynistic and fatphobic content as well in this book. So here's your warning up top. If that's not what you want to listen today, catch us on a different episode. That being said, we also will be spoiling the entire book. So if you haven't read it and you care about spoilers, this is your note to go read and come back. Whether or not you've read the book, you are welcome to the party. It's going to be a wonderful, interesting, weird party where we try to figure out how we feel about this book.
And if maybe, like, if you're a pretty sensitive reader, but you're really intrigued by the book, you know, maybe we can give you a bit of a sense of what it might be like to read and some of the things we wrestled with. Maybe that would prepare you emotionally a bit before you read it. I know that's something I like to have, and maybe that could improve your experience or tell you whether or not you think this book is a good fit for you. But before we get into it, if you would like to support the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. If you're in the book buying mood, maybe for the holidays, if you're like me and you just buy books for everyone in your life, you can go down to our book links in the show notes, and those will link to our affiliate page at bookshop.org, where you can buy books from independent bookstores and we get a very small kickback. And then if you'd like to join the club, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjb, where we review like book to TV or film adaptations, where we've got our archived episodes, lots of autism related content, all kinds of fun stuff. We'd love to see you there.
Okay, so Julia.
Yeah.
This book was recommended to me by our friend Evan James Sheldon, who listeners may remember from our bonus episode on weird short fiction. And he's always reading weird, interesting books in translation and like giving me a little note. And he had mentioned, oh, you and Julia might find this book interesting. You should read it for the podcast. And Whale is definitely a weird, interesting book in translation. So it checks all the Evan boxes. And I messaged him today saying, I read the book. I'm still figuring out how I feel about it, but it was really interesting. I couldn't stop reading it.
Yeah.
Even when I texted you, Julia, and we even talked on the phone a couple times, being like, I kind of want to stop, but I also can't.
Yeah.
I must continue. I must finish this book. And I'm not like as hardcore of like a book finisher as I used to be. Like when I was younger, I used to like power through any book I started. Now I have a pretty mild tolerance for finishing books. If I'm not enjoying it, I'll put it down, come back later. But this book was really demanding my attention and demanded I stick with it. But I'm excited we're talking about it because often this podcast is books that we can't shut up about because we love it. And this one is one that we can't stop reading, but we don't know if we like it.
Yeah.
And so this is a great space to talk about it at book club.
This is a safe spaceship.
I'm like spitting out my tea.
We can't shut up about it because we cannot get a handle on what the heck it is about this book that we like or don't like. How do we feel about it? I don't know. I heard about this book because Here comes the K-pop reference. RM from BTS. It was like on a list of books that he had mentioned or recommended or whatever, like a year or two ago, before the translation came out. So everyone was like eager for the translation. The translation came out like a year or two later. Cause and effect, I don't know. I don't know how, if it was already going to happen or if because he recommended it and there was high demand, the translation, I don't know. But it was always something on my mind that I was like, it sounds really interesting. It's like, it was described to me as like magical realism, multi-generational magical realism was what I thought I was getting into.
Which is like not wrong.
It's
but
not wrong.
Totally what it is.
No. Yeah. And so I read the first chapter and I was like, oh, this feels kind of like Charles Dickens. So aside from like the really heavily descriptive passage about like Chunhee's nipples, so maybe, you know, the male gaze is going to be a little strong. But aside from that, I think I'll enjoy it. And then I read the second chapter and I was like, what the fuck? Oh my god. And Victoria and I had to have a good long discussion about whether to keep going. Like you said, what we ultimately landed on was like, that was so upsetting, but I need to read more. It was so bizarre. After that, I put it down and I was like, I need to keep reading it. I really want to keep reading it, even though I hated that chapter. It was so deeply upsetting. So then I read about halfway through the book and I was like, actually, this is really good. Like, this is really growing on me. Like, sure, it's grotesque, but it's charming and compelling, and like, I'm on board now. I'm on board with this protagonist. Like, she's really interesting. And then I got to the end of the second section where Kumbok transitions, and it's described in a very bizarre way. There's some choices are made, and I was like, what the fuck again? And then I read Chunmi's section at the end, and I was so upset and moved, and it was beautiful, and she sails into space with her elephant, and I was just like, what the fuck do I do with this book?
Yeah, the ending scene, I was like, this wins awards.
Yes!
I was like on Team International Booker Prize at that point, even though I like questioned their interest in this book the entire time I read it.
Yeah.
But then I was like, I see why it got shortlisted for this big prize.
Yeah.
But I also am like,
I still don't know. We've been talking about it nonstop. We've been doing tons of notes and research for this, and like, I still don't know. So that's what this conversation is for, because we still don't know.
And for listeners, if you haven't read the book and you're like, wait, what was tripping you up? What was difficult about this? We'll get into it in like the summary and the discussion more. But, you know, like the second chapter is lots of description of like genitalia as a woman basically rapes a disabled person. Mm-hmm. He's like a boy who...
He's underage and he's disabled.
He's disabled, and like all the emphasis is on the fact that he just has a giant dick.
Yeah.
And of course, how could this woman not?
The way he describes this woman is that this is the ugliest woman you've ever seen in your life. She could not get more ugly. She is hideous. It just over and over and over is like hammering home how ugly this woman is. And so she has access to this boy's giant dick. And so of course she's gonna rape him? I was like, wait.
So that's where we start.
She's brutally beaten by the kid's parents. And then she comes back, and for her revenge, she murders the boy.
Yeah.
That's how the chapter ends.
It's like, chapter 2, welcome to the book, here we go. And you're like, I don't know if I want to be here. I don't know if I signed up for this. But we'll get into that more. We'll put a pin in that, and we'll talk briefly about our author and translator.
Yes, please. Because some context, I think, is helpful.
Yes. For some context. Cheon Myeong-Kwan is a South Korean novelist and screenwriter. He was born in the mid-60s in Yongin, Gyeonggi province. He worked several jobs in his young adult life. He was a clerk at a golf shop. He was an insurance salesperson. After turning 30, he pivoted into the movie industry. He worked at a film company and eventually started to write screenplays. And he did get a few picked up for production, but a lot weren't. He tried to get into directing, but he had a really hard time. So around the age of 40, he's finding himself feeling kind of like a failure in his film career. He's in need of money. And at the encouragement of his brother, he starts writing short stories and novels to make money, which I also find humorous when someone's like, you know how I can make money? I can go write books.
Yeah. I'm going to be rolling in the
only
dough.
thing that makes slightly more money than screenwriting.
Terrifying.
But he did publish his first short story in 2003 and won an award and kind of put him on the map as an emerging writer. The following year, he published Whale and won another big award. So if you're keeping track, this book came out in 2004 in Korean. Since then, he's gone on to publish widely in Korean and even had his novel Modern Family, which is the English title of the book, adapted into the film Boomerang Family, which starred the beloved Yoon Ye-jung, who you may remember as the older version of the main character in Pachinko, the TV series. She was also starring in Minari, and she won an Oscar, which I thought was cool. She was in his film. So he's, his career's doing well. He's, kind of later in his years now. And in 2023, Europa Editions, which is known for doing a lot of works in translation, including the Elena Ferrante series, which we've talked about here on the podcast, they released an English version of the novel Whale. This kind of blew up, got a lot of attention. It was shortlisted for the Booker International Prize, which is a UK prize for books that are published in the UK but are in translation. So they were originally published elsewhere. The publication was by Cheon Kim. She's an award-winning literary translator and editor based in Los Angeles. She grew up kind of helping her mom translate. Her mom was a translator, but as Cheon Kim was a native English speaker, she could help her mom a bit more. So she's kind of always been translating. I know, they were like a mother-daughter translating duo. How fun was that? Our author, when he was, notified that he was in consideration for the prize, he was really surprised. Our author, Cheon, he was saying how, I wrote it quite a long time ago, and the publication of Whale changed my life, and it feels like Whale is still a propulsive force. It's also very fascinating, and this, I think, will come up a bit in our conversation about, not only the importance of translation, but how, in some ways, it's the same book, but it's a different book.
Yeah.
Sean doesn't read and write in English, so he hasn't actually read the version of his book that has been shortlisted for this prize. And it seems like he and Kim, the translator, didn't actually do a lot of collaborative work on the book either.
No.
Kim was saying that this was the first book she's ever translated where she didn't reach out to the author during the process. She said, quote, "I literally had 0 questions for him. It's funny how Mr. Cheon says he wrote the book as if someone were dictating it to him, because translating it was a similar experience. Something about the narrative and the tone and the characters felt so familiar to me. I was reminded of my grandmother, who told me all kinds of folktales and stories when I was young, as well as the Korean books I loved growing up. It felt comfortable, like home." Which is fascinating to me, because I don't know what that experience of translating is like. I assumed there'd be a bit more back and forth. I assumed there'd be a bit more what did you mean here? How does this read to you? But she seems to really take it, from the book itself, as well as, inspired by other books that she found kind of fit the mood. So she said she referenced things like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, the version in translation by Gregory Rabassa, and kind of get inspo from how other translators approached, kind of feelings or similar headspace. I thought that was fascinating for her, how she found the voice was not only in the source text, but also kind of finding its, companion pieces, I guess, in a way.
But also she makes it sound like she felt very much that the Korean text was, in conversation with and drawing from some shared cultural touchstones, some shared stories, some shared storytelling styles that the author, Chun, and the translator, Kim, both had in common, and that are extremely Korean, but extremely specific. So she could hear the voice because she could hear her grandmother telling her those stories. The specific act of, it felt like someone was dictating it to me, I think is interesting, that the author and the translator both felt that way. That it felt like someone was speaking it to them. And it's very much like a spoken oral tradition kind of tone and style. And that because she could hear that, I think is the reason that this book works in translation at all. Because think about, if you didn't get this sort of ironic, exaggerated, kind of folkloric tone, the events and descriptions in this book would be horrifying every step of the way.
Yeah, and it was something that you and I were kind of going back and forth on. And I don't know if we landed on words for it, but this tone that the author and translator are able to create, where you believe enough of it to believe the story, but you also know that it's fantastical, but also that it, like, matters. And it's, like, we're getting a sense of shock and awe, but I don't feel like I'm getting, like, I don't know. Like, there's this line between, like, exploitative and grotesque, where grotesque is interesting and exploitative would be, like, who would write this? Yeah. And they found, like, exactly that line. To tip over into grotesque that I'm like, this is a literary work instead of this is, like, a really horrifying tale. Because even if it is kind of in this folkloric oral tradition, the way it kind of satirizes the genre, it gives you, like, these little moral lessons, like, and this is the law of this. But in such an obnoxious way that you know the book isn't, like, serious. But it's also there enough that if you didn't have that, you'd be like, what is this? Like, yeah, they found, I hesitate using humor because I know we've talked about before when a book is, you're like, it's a funny book. It's like a very poor description of what we mean. Often. It's not laugh out loud funny, but there is some sort of level of funny to it.
Maybe ironic is better?
Maybe.
Than funny? Because you don't laugh. But you know it has a point, and you know that point is not for it to be taken seriously. Like, you know that they don't mean... Is this the right way to say it? You know they don't mean what they're saying, I guess? But they do, but they don't, but they do. Is that the right way to describe it? Where it's like, well, let me describe the plot first before we just tie ourselves in knots.
We'll come back to that.
We'll come back to it. We're gonna, because you mentioned a few things, right? You mentioned, like, different elements of folklore. You mentioned grotesque. You meant, like, exaggeration. We've got a couple of those. We'll come back around, I promise. So, first of all, this is how the Booker Prize site describes it, kind of the overarching sense of it. Set initially in a remote village in South Korea, Whale follows the lives of 3 linked characters. Gumbok, an extremely ambitious woman who has been chasing an indescribable thrill ever since she first saw a whale crest in the ocean. Her mute daughter, Cheon, who communicates with elephants, and a one-eyed woman who controls honeybees with a whistle. And you read that and you're just like, what on earth is this book about?
Like, at the same time, that's a very accurate summary. That's exactly what does it tell you? So let's expand a bit.
Yeah. So the one-eyed woman, and that is what she's called, and that I feel like is one of the elements of the oral tradition storytelling, is the fact that so many of the characters just have, like, an epigraph as a name and no real name. So her name is the One-Eyed Woman, is the magical bee-whispering daughter of this bitter old crone who we talked about, the very ugly woman who assaults the disabled boy and then murders him. That's the old crone. So she's the daughter of a bitter old crone who hoarded a bunch of money, cursed it, and then hid it in her ceiling, as you do. The old crone also beat her and stabbed her in the eye and sold her off when she was super young to a beekeeper.
For 2 jars of honey, which is so sad.
So upsetting. The One-Eyed Woman really can only connect with bees, and her entire life is focused on destroying her mother and taking the money she believes is rightfully hers. However, this drive leads to the destruction of all her bees, or most of them, and a sense of profound isolation and defeat by the end. She seems to decay like a tree, rather than die, as she slowly grows mushrooms in her body and ends up dissolving into the forest. These all have very sad endings, just heads up. Kumbok, arguably the central protagonist, is extremely ambitious and in an extremely oppressive and patriarchal world. So she, and later he, which is a whole thing that we'll address, and I feel like the best way to deal with it is how the author deals with it, which is when we're talking about the part of the book where Kumbok is using he, him pronouns, we will use he, him pronouns. If we're talking about the part of the book where Kumbok's using she, her pronouns, we will use she, her. So Kumbok travels between men who can give her power, between business opportunities that can give her money, and between towns in hopes of finally being satisfied. Her grand design of a whale-shaped theater, combining her obsessions with whales and movies, both of which were very formative in expanding her view of what is possible, and creating her sense of self and her desires and all these things, as well as her greed in using up the old crone's cursed money to pay for this theater, are what end up being her undoing when the theater burns to the ground with her in it. Cheon, Kumbok's daughter, is extremely autism-coded. Like, my god. She is somehow the daughter of an impossibly large man, and Kumbok, even though Kumbok hadn't slept with him in years, She can't speak and understands very little of what people are saying, but she is able to like telepathically communicate with a retired circus elephant and is very in touch with the natural world. Her strength and sensitivity help her to connect with people or animals and give her a sense of purpose, but they also make her a target for bitter cruelty and isolation. After spending a decade in prison for the theater fire, which wasn't her fault, she is determined to return to her mother's brickyard and continue making bricks in the hopes of finding her loved ones again. She even puts drawings of herself in the bricks and becomes a kind of legend as the Red Brick Queen, and so like her story kind of lives on and it's transmuted over time and becomes something entirely different. And at the very end, as we mentioned, she sort of sails into space with her best friend, the retired circus elephant, and it's stunning. I don't know how, but it's stunning. And this is really a story about how these women's like inherent unchangeable qualities bring them some success in getting what they want in this like really messed up world, but also ultimately bring them to sad and lonely ends, cut off from themselves and their loved ones. And also I think centrally how through the stories that have gotten passed down and expanded over time, these characters have become kind of immortalized. And it feels like part of what we're reading in this book is like their myth almost, more than like the exact events that quote unquote actually happened to them. I feel like we need a new slogan for our show.
Oh, yeah?
That's just resolving our conflicting feelings about complicated award-winning novels one podcast episode at a time.
Yes.
We do this a lot now.
I know. Yes, we do.
This is book therapy.
Welcome to book therapy with Julie and Victoria.
Welcome to book therapy. So it sounds like this character reminded you of your mother. Can you talk more about that?
So yes, we found this book very upsetting and frustrating. We have very strong male gaze on our female characters, meaning we get a lot of objectifying of their bodies. We have like a very complicated like gender transition. We have like rape and murder, and the people who are doing a lot of the harming aren't always or ever punished for their actions. You know, there's not like a good guy or a good gal that wins the day. Yeah. It's just like a lot of like sad stuff, but also maybe hopeful too. Because there are these beautiful moments, but what's striking to me is the sense that we couldn't put it down. Like what, at the same time, this book has some disturbing elements, but also has all these very compelling elements. Like what's happening here? Let's dig into this.
Yeah, because I think an important point that we landed on when we decided that we were going to continue reading it and discuss it was, like, this is clearly occurring in a style and a tradition that we find very compelling but don't fully understand. And so I feel like we are not the ultimate deciders of, like, why this book is good or what it's trying to do. You know what I mean? Like, we there's more we have to dig into. However, I will say, when we were trying to figure out, like, how do people who read it in the original Korean, obviously it won an award, but how do they perceive it? And this obviously is not representative of everyone's view, but there's a website called Namjoon's Bookshelf where they review and discuss in quite interesting ways, actually. I would highly recommend you check them out. Any of the books that Namjoon from BTS reads or recommends or incorporates into their music or anything like that. One of their sort of admins read the book in Korean, and this is what they said. So they said, a satirical story of fate and hard choices, Whale reflects on downward spiraling lives and the meaning of it all. It's a very tough book to read. All three women have disabilities and suffer through life differently, while the male gaze and desire constantly loom over them. Treading the line between fantasy and reality, its tragic endings piece together a compelling story. They also felt like, for women in particular, this book is very tough to read. They gave it a positive review, but they were like, it's very hard to read. So we would just start with that to our listeners. If you found this difficult, you're not alone. And it's something I think the professional reviews don't ever address, that I feel like they should, even when they really love it and give rave reviews for it. I feel like they never really touch on, which is why I appreciated this review so much. They never really touch on, like, this deals with difficult themes and really horrible things to happen to all our main characters. And so, like, it can be very heavy, but there's something about it that's really compelling anyway.
And I think what can be so compelling, and maybe what adds to the complexity of this, is it's not like a really sad story that's just like a, creative nonfiction account of someone's really difficult life. We have it in a specific context, in a specific genre, that gives us this kind of sense of like, should we be feeling these like happy storytelling vibes? Or should we be feeling heavy reality vibes? And we're kind of straddling between fantasy and reality, and I think that's maybe where we're getting a bit of this interesting tension.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from the genre of folktale, we get a lot of elements here, like the exaggerated descriptions of everything. Everything is kind of over the top. There's a theater the size and shape of a whale. There's like an elephant who lives a very long time, and
can talk.
Yeah, it's to one person.
To one person, right.
We have these twins that are so identical that even at the twins' deaths, the twins themselves don't remember who was who. Yeah. And, like, the world does not know which twin was which twin. Like, it's, like, exaggerated, right? Like, and we have these elements that were repeated. We get a lot of repetition. So again, when you're telling a story in our folk tales, we're getting really, like, tangible qualities that you can grab onto, and they're repeated time and again. So in Pinocchio, we get, like, his nose. His nose is a big focus. The fact that he's a wooden boy. Like, we get these very tangible qualities, and that's what we see in this story as well. So we have Gumbuk, who has a very specific smell that follows her most of her life, and it fluctuates depending on what's going on, but typically it's the smell that's so tantalizing to men that men everywhere get erections. Yeah. And they're just like, want to do anything they can to be with her or partner with her in some way. And it's just so exaggerated that there's such a specific smell that everyone can smell. Though in some small moments of her life while she's suffering or during her gender transition, like, the smell goes away and there's, like, these changing qualities. We have characters like the fishmonger, who, at first I was like, okay, he's like not a very important character, so he doesn't get a name. No, he's in the whole frickin' book. Yeah. The fishmonger is very crucial. He does a lot of things. He's the one who gets Gumbuk out of town. She's her first, like, sexual partner. It's also complicated because she's, like, underage and, like, probably not consenting. But then they become, like, a couple in a way. They're business partners. He goes away. He ends up moving back in with her when she's, like, relocated to a new town. He runs her, like, taxi business. Very integral in a lot of ways, but he never gets a name. He's the fishmonger. And he smells the fish. Even his ghost smells like fish. Like, he hasn't lived near the ocean in years. He hasn't touched a fish, and he still smells like fish. So we have these, like, super exaggerated, like, characters that really, like, pop out of the page. But often, I mean, these examples are, invoking smell, and all these characters are evoking very strong senses in different ways. So we've got, like, our twins who are so visually similar. Like, that's, like, the cue. Even though we don't get, like, descriptions of how they look, we just know two women who look exactly identical, even though they're different people, but maybe they're not. The fishmonger, again, we know nothing else. How tall is he? What color is his face? What color are his eyes? Like, does he, like, enjoy coffee in the morning? No, we know nothing, but he smells like fish.
And he's not the only one who doesn't get a name, right? There's the trickster, Gumbuk's, like, childhood friend who comes back, like, several different times.
I really love that it's always the same guy. It
always
almost
the same
feels
guy?
like a folktale kind of trope where it's like, you have this one character that if this was like a story like Pachinko, right? Like a realistic historical novel, it would be a different dude.
Yeah.
Who's just different people, but they're like, it's a folktale. So the trickster, he comes back 5 times.
But he's always called the trickster.
Always the trickster.
And there's the fishmonger, there's the old crone, there's the one-eyed woman, right? That's just who they are. They are defined by this one inherent quality about them that even though, like, the old crone is not always old, when she's still of childbearing age, when she has her daughter, she's described as the old crone. And to me, that felt like a very folktale-y quality. Like, if you think about, like, even if you think about, like, fairy tales or something, right? Every character is always defined by a particular job or a physical feature or a personality trait. You think about, like, Cinderella. Like, her name is literally, like, she's just dirty all the time. That's That's her name. But another element that's very folktale-esque is that there are lessons to be learned that are addressed to the reader, like from the narrator, right? Sort of talking about, hypothesizing about human nature, like drawing, from philosophy, drawing conclusions about the characters, right? There's sort of this thing outside of the on-the-ground events of the story that's sort of discussing what's going on. And so I think the most obvious one is this section where the narrator's talking about Gumbok, and it's when the old crone's money, like, literally falls out of Gumbok's ceiling in the middle of the night, and so Gumbok is, like, drowning in this pile of money, and she's, like, deciding what to do with it. And so this is what the narrator says. They have this quote, this sort of common saying of, "We become ourselves according to our behavior." This might explain a human's irrational actions. A person doesn't act according to a predetermined personality, but rather their behavior reveals their personality. But that is something that extends beyond this story, much like the questions, did this miraculous good luck befall Gumbok because she is the protagonist of this story, or is she the protagonist because this good luck came to her? Or is it the chicken or the egg? Perhaps we can explain Gumbok's behavior this way. By building a brickyard in a swamp, Gumbok became a rash and foolish woman. There is always a bottom to a well, no matter how deep it is. So there's these sort of always statements, these sort of big picture, like, what is human nature, right? Where does your personality come from? Do your actions reveal who you are, or do you have to act that way because of something inherent about you, right? This is sort of like a moral that the narrator is dealing with, that the whole story is really dealing with. Is this something that these characters had to do because they were that way, or did they become that way because of how they acted?
And I think that's kind of one of the elements, too, that makes it feel more like a modern fairy tale, because we're getting, like, these lessons learned, but they're very, like, self-aware narrator talking to reader, and it's often a lot of, like, questions than it is, like, actually, this is what it is. The times where we get, like, this is a lesson to be learned, it's very, like, satirical and very ridiculous. So the book will, like, give an example of, how Gumbok's business was growing, and the effect it had on the laborers, and he'll just end the section with, like, and this is the law of capitalism. Or, like, we're getting these, like, here's a lesson to be learned, but it's, like, ridiculous, or we get these, like, more existential questions, like, I don't know, it made me pause and think, I'm like, when we have a central protagonist, is it good luck because the story's supposed to be about her, or is the story about her because this happened? Which, again, we're dealing with a fictional character, so you're like, well, but then the author is kind of positioning as if this was a real thing that happened. It's fun. There's layers. It's very, like, modern in that way.
And it's meta in the sense that it calls attention to the fact that this is a protagonist in a story as well. Another
element of the folktale is that all of our characters get backstories. Even if we have to interrupt the flow, all of the characters come back. Like, we have to understand what's going on. We have to, like, go back in time and tell their story, and we figure out what's happening. And then also, like we mentioned, we get these, like, improbable events where, like, the trickster comes back yet again. The one-eyed woman shows up, and you're just like, how are you still alive? Like, my sense of time is just completely gone. I feel like everyone lived both really long and very short lives. The way the book is kind of broken up as well is each chapter acts as almost like its own tale, its own story. Yeah. And it kind of fits together in a cohesive way. It's very much a novel, but it's kind of like, and here's a story about the old crone. And turns out the old crone's going to come back 17 other times. But, like, you feel like it's this one complete story, and you move on. And even in the very opening chapter, we get Chun Hui's moment when she comes back to the brickyard at the very beginning of the book, when we have no idea what's happening yet. And basically, the whole story is told to you at that point. Like, her mom had a successful business and died. Her stepfather loved her very much, was, like, the only person who really cared for her, died. Like, everyone's gone. She's been in prison. There was a terrible fire. Like, we get all the plot points in chapter 1. Yeah. And so then the rest of the book is just going back in time to tell all the backstories and get us back to the brickyard at that moment. Finally, in this, like, the third section.
Yeah, that's true. And that's something the author even talked about. He was like, I spent a really long time on the first chapter because that sets up the entire book. And then the rest of it, it felt like it was just kind of pouring out of him, like he just all in one go. But yeah, that's a good point about that first chapter. In a way, the whole book is backstory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like every single person and every single plot point needs a whole little bite-sized tale about what happened. And this was actually something that reminded me of Dickens a little bit, actually, the way that the characters kept coming back. That's a very Dickensian thing to do as well.
Yeah.
Where, like, you think it's just a minor character who gets this one little flash in the pan story, and they're this very, like, quirky person that our hero interacts with, and then, oh, we're never going to see them again. And then, surprise, they're back!
Right. It's like in David Copperfield, where, like, he goes and, like, lives with this family that has way too many kids, and, like, they're kind of escaping, you know, all the creditors and whatnot. And then randomly, he's, like, in a completely different part of the country, going to boys' school, and that guy, the, like, father of that family, shows up as, like, the teacher. And then at the end, they all, like, end up back together in London. You're just like, how are you still here? But it's, like, fun.
Yeah, and I think it adds some unreality, right? That really helps you get the sense, like, oh, this is not real. And it helps you get attached to these kind of archetypes, and it's interesting to see how the archetypes interact with our main characters at different points in time. Because, like, the trickster, from his name, we know he's gonna be a trickster at some point, right? And eventually he runs off with Gumbok's wife after managing the theater for a while, and he goes and scams people somewhere else and eventually gets caught. And then eventually we hear about his demise because his wife ends up in prison with Chunhui. And so we get, like, we hear his entire life story over the course, in flashbacks, in little bites, over the course of the whole book. It's like a very bizarre way to tell a story where, as you said, normally his role would have been taken up by different men throughout. And then something that feels very, I think I would maybe say fairy tale, is the way that they are very funny and kind of exaggerated in kind of an ironic way, but then end in devastating tragedy. Like, everyone dies, everything is terrible, right? And that's part of the kind of quality of the genre. And so I pulled out this one paragraph.
I think this is a great example.
This is a really great example of the author's humor, where a lot of his humor is like repetition. So, the vertical way of living for Pyeongdae inhabitants came to an end when the railroad came to the village. Soldiers, really surveyors, but Pyeongdae residents believed them to be soldiers, wore military helmets, really safety gear, but Pyeongdae residents believed them to be military helmets, and held machine guns, really surveyor's tools, but Pyeongdae residents believed them to be machine guns, as they went from this hill to that hill and herded rabbits all day. That was what Pyeongdae residents believed them to be doing, and went away without having caught a single rabbit. Not long after that, a tank, really a bulldozer, but Pyeongdae residents believed it to be a tank, appeared in the hills behind the village and began mercilessly to level the mountain. You just get the same refrain over and over and over again, and the kind of contrast is really funny. It's just really exaggerated. It's just something about how big it is makes it feel so, like, it gives, this part is probably where I laughed the hardest while reading this book. So there's this constant kind of quirky, I hate to use the word quirky to describe this book, but I don't know how else to describe it, kind of ironic tone. And yet, all of their stories end in horrible tragedy. I don't know a single character whose story ends well. Can you think of one?
No. And even when they had, like, generally a happy-ish ending to their lives, it was still, like, a terrible thing that, like, no one, like, dies comfortably of old age, it seems like, in this book. Even one of the twins who ostensibly went off with a man she fell in love with and, like, had a happy last days, turns out was, like, accidentally electrocuted. And then we get this whole thing about which twin was it? Was it actually the twin that was in love with the engineer, or did another one go off with him because she was doing a favor for her sister? And, like, then it gets so complicated, you know, like, either this is terribly tragic that this twin sister spent the last years apart, or did we get a love story? We don't know. It, like, takes it away a bit. But yeah, in the very folktale where tragedy just, like, is inherent to their lives. In a way, this book is very fantastical, and it's set in, like, a Korean village. But there's enough allusion and details about history that we are mapping this onto a specific time period. So we actually kind of skip past all of the war years, like the Korean War. And they're all told in summary. And so we get kind of, here's a peek at some of that very, like, tragic events that continually happen to our protagonist. Within 2 years of her departure, she ended up begging, going from house to house. She was no longer the gumbuk she once was. Though she was a woman, she didn't look much like one, and though she had a human name, she didn't much look like a human being. Ill-tempered women yanked her around by the hair, and rough men demanded to bed her, and it was common for other beggars to beat her and leave her in ditches. This was the law of the world.
So that's an example of one of those refrains where he says, this is the law of blank, like you were talking about. But the fact that this is the one that says this is the law of the world, this is the only one that says that, and it's describing how horrible Gumbok's life is during the war years, I was like, oh my god, like this is, you're basically arguing that life and the world as a whole are inherently about pain and suffering and, like, beating each other up and, like, brutal power dynamics and just, like, horrible, horrible things. And yet, because we get this repeated refrain, that's the thing that's saying it, right? It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And also immediately after this, or not immediately after, but soon after this, Gumbok finds the twins, really blossoms and becomes herself again in this sort of loving environment, and then moves to Pyeongdae and, like, is really, really successful and, like, gains a lot of power. Like, there's a lot of, like, this is not the end of her story, and so we don't dwell here. But I thought it was interesting that, like, at the heart of it, the story is saying this is the law of the world. And I was like, that is a very folktale thing to do.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I think for a lot of Americans, at least, and I would be interested to hear how this has spread around the world, but a lot of our fairy tales, our first encounter with them is through Disney. And Disney specifically has a brand of being all about happy endings. And then a lot of us have these sort of really traumatic experiences, like reading the real Cinderella story and reading about how the stepsisters, like, chopped off their feet so that they could fit in the shoes. And you're like, wait, what? Right? So it's like the original fairy tales are much more like this book than they are like Disney. They're gross and they're exaggerated and they end often very sad. And when people do get what they want, often it goes horribly wrong. They are trying to communicate something about how monstrous the world is in an exaggerated, quirky way to children.
Often when I think of a fairy tale, I'm thinking of we even use the phrase, like, it's such a fairy tale ending, when we talk about someone who had, like, a happy thing happen to them or, like, a good ending to some episode of their life. And I think the folktale tradition that these fairy tales are coming from is much more grounded, like you said, in these lessons to be taught, these warnings to give to children, these kind of crazy tales to entertain, and that everything working out in the end every single time actually isn't that entertaining. And so having these, like, unexpected twists and these characters where, like, and then they just died, like, that's how life goes sometimes. You just die in the middle of the story, and that's kind of where it ends. I think having to, like, cast aside my idea of Disney fairy tales and, like, recenter around, like, okay, what do I actually know about the tradition of folk tales? If I look at the kind of base stories of the folk tales from my tradition that I grew up in, like, what am I seeing differently? And this actually made me think of with, like Bible stories, right? Like, yes. We have, like, a children's Bible that's, like, illustrated. It's got very pretty pictures. It'll have the story of Noah's Ark. What it won't show is
all the people drowning?
The entire population of humanity and animals just dead, completely dead. And instead it's just, like, pretty rainbows and, like, an elephant on a boat. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that, these children's Bibles will cut out a lot of stories. Like, we'll still get the story of Abraham, but it'll be, like, Disney-fied. Where it's like, he wasn't really gonna kill his son. And we're like, he kind of was. He definitely was.
Yeah.
We'll remove the rape and the incest, and we'll be like,
Yes.
here's a story of, like, the, tribes of Israel, and this led to the, here's the Old Testament and the New Testament, and yada yada, Jesus loves you at the end of every single story. And it's like, then you grow up a bit, and you don't have the Children's Bible anymore, and you're reading it, and you're like 12 in Sunday school, and you're like, this is not the story I thought it was. Yeah. And so, understanding this as a folktale, I guess, is like coming back to that, like, tradition of, this isn't supposed to be fun and games. This book is definitely not for children. Like, we have this idea that folktale is for children. It's also to entertain adults, to swap stories and talk about our origins and the creepy things in the night and the ways the life can twist and turn.
And I think something that helped me deal with the obsession in this book with dicks, first of all, and brutality, and like talking about these really extreme physical qualities of people, and like any of the descriptions of what it's just physically like to be a human being. The word grotesque kept coming back to me because it really felt like the author, a lot of these books are sort of dealing with kind of how gross it is to be a body. And yes, it's very exaggerated in this book, but like being a body is gross. I think that's also a very strong element of fairy tales, is like the grotesque. So I wanted to look up and kind of talk about like what the grotesque is in literature specifically. And so this is what I found, and it shared some very interesting light on like helping me how I think about this book.
Yeah.
The grotesque is primarily concerned with the distortion and transgression of boundaries. So these could be physical boundaries between objects or psychological boundaries, and it's a lot of exaggeration. And so it's supposed to be unsettling. It's supposed to be big and exaggerated. And a lot of times it's also crossing kind of genre boundaries as well. So it's sort of between the real and the not real, between the real and the fantastical. So kind of in that magical realism space, and also between being funny and being frightening, which I was like, that's exactly what this book is.
Yeah.
You don't know what to do with like, this book is funny and also horrifying, and I'm sitting in the middle, so compelled. That's a lot of what the grotesque is for, is it's designed to bridge that boundary. And it's not meant to just be caricature, right? So a caricature would be these sort of exaggerated portrayals that are making fun of people, right? It would be more satire, where, it's exaggerated in order to mock someone. That's not what the grotesque is for. It's not exaggerating a negative phenomenon for the purpose of rejecting it, which I thought was really interesting. This is from Bakhtin.
I wrote many a Bakhtin paper back in the day.
Oh yeah, if you're a theory girly like us, this is some Bakhtin. So it's not about exaggerating the negative phenomenon in order to reject it, but rather the way Bakhtin describes it is to quote unquote uncrown it, to remove it from a state of untouchableness so that it can be renewed. So basically, it's trying to take away the power of that exaggerated negative thing. So this made me think of all the dick stuff in particular, where it's like, we're not exaggerating the male gaze and the male sex drive and for the purposes of throwing it away completely or saying this is inherently evil or something along those lines. It's rather to take away its power and to re-examine it so that it can be changed.
Yeah.
Right? It's all about this sort of border crossing.
It makes me think of like, I really like how you were drawing this comparison between like the grotesque and specifically the use of like talking about dicks all the time in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing it's doing is it's giving a grotesque element to the patriarchy elements by making it completely visible. So we're using this constant conversation of genitalia. In a way, it's also saying, this is a world of the patriarchy. These characters live in the patriarchy. Like, it's not this, like, unknowable thing in this book. It's just, like, how big is the dick? Like, that's... what's going on here? We know it's dicks.
Yeah.
But by taking away the power of it, it's not like, oh, like, why are these women having hardships in their lives? The book is like, we know why. The world is terrible.
It's the dicks.
It's a lot of dicks. And this kind of exaggeration, I mean, I might be jumping ahead of where you wanted to go with this, but like this again, finding this line between two things, this exaggeration, that's kind of how Gumbuk's gender transition feels, right? It feels exaggerated. Yeah. It feels unsettling because as a reader familiar with LGBTQ work, like, I'm like, this feels like a really odd way to talk about gender transition. There's a lot of like innate personality changes. There's like this, discussion of like whether or not Gumbuk's enlarged clitoris becomes a dick. Like, there's just like a lot of stuff going on, but putting it in the lens of the grotesque, it's kind of like, well, let's sit and examine it. We've kind of been telling this whole story about how living under the patriarchy has influenced these women, and Gumbuk has worked so hard to be successful in this space that in a grotesque storytelling way, she has become a man because that's the way to consolidate power and to have money and to like be in charge. But the book doesn't leave you with like an answer. Right? The grotesque is examining. It's not saying, and this is a bad thing. It's not saying like, oh, look how ugly and terrible this is. Let's mock it. It's like, this is exaggerated and weird and grotesque and like...
And it's a boundary crossing.
Yeah.
That like one of the most firm ones in the book is of gender. And that gets blurred in Gumbuk's story in a very bizarre way. It's very funny because like the author respects his pronoun transition. Yeah. They're like, okay, from here on out, Gumbuk, identifies as a man, so we're going to use he, him pronouns. Like, let's go. And I'm like, wow, 2004, like, great. Yeah. Let's do it.
In the same way, they're like, you might be wondering how, Gumbuk, he's now he, him, is having sex with this woman. Let me tell you, sex is happening. Like, it's like, yeah that's right.
Gumbuk helped this woman find parts of herself that she had never experienced with another man before. And you're like, yeah, she did. And I was like really surprised. And then there are other elements of how the transition is described where Gumbuk takes on, like, suddenly becomes a worse person. Yeah. Like, takes on these qualities of men that he had hated his whole life and is like, but now that I am a man, I do these things. And so it's a little bit essentialist, and a little bit exaggerated, but it's also blurring that boundary of like acceptable and unacceptable and kind of it takes the power out of gender a little bit. And so you're like so confused about all the choices that the author is making, and yet it never feels disrespectful. It never feels insulting. It feels like, well, yeah, what if? In a really fascinating way. And something else that I thought was interesting is in the research I did on the grotesque, they also connected it to the carnivalesque, which I saw used to describe whale specifically, which is when the order of the world is reversed temporarily. So the top becomes the bottom becomes the top. In the case of a traditional carnival, the king is for a day dethroned and a beggar becomes king for a day. There's a specific name for it, like this practice that I think they actually discuss in Dawn of Everything. It's like, it has a specific like anthropological term.
So if you want the Disney version, listen to the song Topsy Turvy from Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yes. I mean, Hunchback is a great example. The very beginning of that story is essentially about that role reversal. But there's also what is it called? The reversal of, it's like a temporary reversal of the order of hierarchy as to act as a sort of release valve to like let the people on the bottom let off steam for a bit and then everything goes back to normal. And so in the grotesque, it's specifically applied to the body. So the inside is the outside and the outside is the inside. The genders are reversed. The body is more gross.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like as someone becomes, more like the old crone, the more she hates the world, the uglier she becomes. And like,
yeah.
But she was already ugly to begin with. And it's just like this cyclical thing is she just becomes uglier. And that's the story of the old crone.
And she's like covered in her own shit.
Yeah.
Ugh, disgusting. So I think the grotesque was a really helpful way for me to think about this book because it puts it in a particular practice that makes a lot of sense. And you can kind of see what some of the choices that the author makes, what they're doing in their particular moments because when you're reading it, you're like, I should be way more bothered by this. And sometimes I was really bothered. Most of the time, though, I wasn't. But I was like, I should be bothered by this. And even the things that did bother me, I kind of got used to them because of how, like, if I trusted the narrator enough, he would do something with it that was really interesting or empowering or, like, world shifting, you know, of like making me think about something. And so like if you put up with the weird shit for long enough, you would get to something really interesting. Sometimes right away, sometimes you'd have to wait a bit.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, one of the first questions you and I had when we started reading this was, how am I supposed to read this book?
Yeah.
Like, we wanted an answer, and I don't think there's ever one answer of how to read a book. That's why literary criticism and book club and, like, chatting about books is so fun. It's because there's so many ways to read a book. But just now, this conversation of the grotesque is really helping me feel like, oh, this is a way that I would enjoy reading this book. That I enjoy reading this book is through this lens, because I'm reminded of, like, ooh, like, let's think about how we see, you know, the inversions in society in other books we read, and, like...
Yes.
So another way to think about this book, and maybe another lens we can use, is this idea of oral tradition. As we mentioned, we have these elements of folktale that are common in oral tradition, so we've got repetitive refrains, we have the narrator directly addressing the audience, saying things like, but let us move on from stories about the war and save all that for another day. Reader, I ask for your understanding. It's like the narrator is talking to us. We have these epigraphs for characters, meaning like these descriptions that come back again and again. So we have, this dude actually does have a name, but he's often referred to as the man with a scar, the renowned con artist, notorious smuggler, superb butcher, rake, pimp of all the prostitutes on the wharf, and hot-tempered broker, was a taciturn man. And we get this like super long phrase every single time we address him.
Yes. Even after he's dead. When we're recalling how he influenced Gumbuk to, like, go to the theater and stuff, or she murders him, actually, so she feels very guilty about it. Every time he's brought up again throughout the story, we get this entire phrase, renowned con artist, notorious smuggler, superb butcher, rake, pimp, like, we get the whole thing, and after a while it becomes funny. That's a very, like, if you've read any Homer, that's something you'll be familiar with. Right? Every time we mention Achilles, we have to get his entire epigraph about how he's the daughter of a god. The daughter. Kind of. How he's the son of a goddess, and he's super angry, and he's whatever, right?
It's like, if you forgot who this person is, let me tell you. We will remember who he is.
Well, and part of it, with Homer at least, is that it has to fit the meter. And so epigraphs that's the reason they're repeated, right? Is because they have a particular rhythm that allows you, it makes it very helpful for filling out the meter of your poem as you're reciting by heart. So that's part of it.
It gives the person reciting a moment to remember what comes next, because they can just, like,
yes.
talk about Achilles' category the whole time.
Exactly.
The part of the story that felt most oral tradition for me, though, was this, like, gossipy narrative point of view. And so, so much of the book is centered around the gossip grapevine. And you can kind of, like, debate, like, how much is the narrator within and beyond this, like, the gossip of the people. But in, like, the example you read to us of, like, what the Pyeongdae villagers thought was going on when the surveyors came to build the train track, in the end, people figured, like, Pyeongdae villagers and the narrator, everyone eventually knew what they were doing, but they have the gossip of the village. You have, like, what everyone thinks is going on. It's like, oh, they were out hunting rabbits, but they're really bad at it, and they didn't get any. And it's like, you get this kind of sense that this is a compilation of stories, and this is actually where we're getting the book that we're reading, is through this account that has been transmuted orally, and the way people have gossiped about these people is how we come to know them as readers.
And there's so many times where, like, we question the source of the information. The author directly addresses that there's multiple versions of a story, and one of the versions of the story that people were spreading around through the rumor mill was the version that we're getting. And the author will be like, but how ridiculous is that, right? Like, the real one that we get is the most ridiculous one. Like, when they're talking about when people are speculating where Gumbuk got her money. Some people said this, some people said this, some people said this, and some people said it appeared to her in the night, which is the one that happens in the story. And so it constantly calls into question, like, well, maybe this entire story is just the really exaggerated version that people shared over time. And it just kind of spiraled out of control and turned into this oral tradition that we are then getting in writing today. And so it's constantly calling into question what is real. And there are a couple times where the author specifically says what his source is. So like towards the very end says, Chun-Hui also drew on the bricks that she made, conveying ever so faintly the remaining days of her life. Here, it must be said that the following story is pulled from these sources. So the story that we're getting is just someone's interpretation of the pictures that Chun-Hui drew of her own life. And it's been sort of blown out of proportion into this really dramatic tale that we get. Which, that one was really fascinating to me because he's really showing his hand of like, this is purely based on the stories that people have like reached a consensus on over time by telling them to each other over and over. And like, how much are they based in reality? I don't know. And he even has a quote of like, is there such thing as objective truth? How credible is a story that floats through the world going from mouth to mouth? Here too, we do not have answers, right? So this is a very, again, postmodern folktale. He continues, by its very nature, a story contains adjustments and embellishments depending on the listener's convenience, depending on the storyteller's skills. Reader, you will believe what you want to believe. That's all there is to it. So he's literally revealing exactly what's going on of like, choose whatever you want, interpret however you want. We don't know what we can trust when it's just these stories pass through the rumor mill. And so it's a very meta way to do a folktale, right? Which is why this is like very much a contemporary folktale, because it's tipping its hat to and showing how folklore occurs, right? It's just stories that have been repeated through word of mouth, through generations, and over time they become these ridiculous things. But they could be based in truth. They could be based in something that really happened. So what do you believe? And what do you think is the heart of the story that you're going to take out of it?
Yeah.
And that really helps me with some of the more insulting things, I think, where it's like, people as a collective can be really cruel and they could tend to exaggerate when telling stories and gossiping about other people. And like, it helps kind of explain and helps me deal with some of the more negative descriptions of the characters, I think.
So yeah, I think reflecting back on like my understanding and learning a bit more from you about the grotesque, about folktales, thinking about how we use oral tradition and how we see it here in the book, I'm like getting more comfortable with the story.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think I'm landing on the side of I like it. I think it's doing something really interesting. And obviously is sparking a lot of conversation. And makes me also want to like, I don't know, unpack more layers about it. Like, it's now I want to reread it, which is, I'm coming a long way from a few days ago where I'm like, I don't want to finish this book. And now I'm like, do I read it again?
Yeah.
Where do you feel now?
This would be a great book for school. Because I could write hella papers about this. You know what I mean? You could apply every single lens that we just talked through and like come to a different conclusion, you know, especially if you put this book in conversation with other Korean literature of the time or like, you know, its sort of folktale tradition, which I feel like we have not read nearly enough Korean literature to get a sense of how this book sits in its own specifically Korean context, but we get a hint of it from how the translator talked about it. So you get the sense that like this is very much in a particular style that's very familiar to a Korean audience. So like I would want to dig more into that and read more books of like what influenced and inspired this book and see how the style compares and what this book is doing differently versus what it's doing the same. Like I have so many, I could write hella papers about this book. I would love to do more research. I think comfortable is a great way to describe it. I too am getting more comfortable with it where it's like, you know, it's kind of like when you watch a stand-up special from someone who's from a super different context to you and some of their jokes make you really uncomfortable and you have to like sit with them for a while and you're like, wait, why is this funny to people? You know, and you have to figure out, like, I like doing that sometimes where I don't laugh watching it, but I use it as kind of an insight into a new perspective where I'm like, why is this funny to people? And trying to put it together in the puzzle of my understanding of the world. And I feel like this was something similar where like, you know, going outside your comfort zone, you're gonna be uncomfortable at first. And I think even in the midst of me being kind of horrified and confused and like, what is going on? Like, there was something at the heart of it that was so entertaining and interesting and compelling, and it was just familiar enough that I had things to grab onto. Talking about it now, I agree. I'm like, I think it's kind of fascinating that this was written in 2004.
Yeah. It's like almost 20 years old.
Yeah. In some ways it feels a bit old, but it also kind of holds up. Kind of a jarring gateway into a whole world of literature that I think we're just getting started on.
Yeah. So for readers who are interested in other books that might have a similar vibe, what would you recommend they check out next?
I mean, yeah, we've mentioned Dickens several times. I would recommend David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I think other reviewers also compared it to David Copperfield. It's similar in that it's like partially coming of age and then partially coming into power kind of story with all these kind of quirky recurring characters and spans a big amount of time and, is examining things about society. Like, I think if you enjoyed this book, I think you'd find it pretty similar, or the most similar thing that I can think of. What about you?
If you are interested in some weird modern fairy tales, Children in Their Cages by Evan James Sheldon, friend of the pod, check it out. It's a bunch of short flash fiction pieces. Also, we'll link in the show notes, but Europa Editions put out a book list of books recommended by Cheon Myeong-Kwan. These were, inspiring to him as he was writing Whale.
Oh, perfect.
The first one on here, I'll just read his little blurb, was Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Cheon said, I picked up this novel at a bookstore on a whim. Just a few pages in, I realized I felt so close to this writer's very soul and became a huge lifelong fan. At the time, Vonnegut's work wasn't well known in Korea, so I thought I was the only one who secretly revered him, but increasingly people began talking about him. I was deeply offended and wanted to burn all his books so nobody could read them. More and more people are becoming fans, and everyone and their mother were talking about Vonnegut, like they had shared a drink with him at a bar. Yet again, tragically, my unrequited love was dismantled. So it goes. I thought that was super entertaining. And there's a whole list of books there that you can read that, kind of inspired Whale. And lastly, currently obsessed. Here are the things that are bringing us joy that have nothing to do with Whale.
There's a new-ish podcast, I think that started this summer, called The Handsome Podcast, with Tig Notaro, Fortune Feimster, and Mae Martin.
What?
And it's just some pals chatting, and then every episode they answer a really random question from one of their friends. They've talked about ghosts, they've talked about how they wash their bodies, they've talked about pizza. It just really runs the gamut, but they are so delightful, and I highly recommend. Taemin, the king of K-pop, Taemin has a new album, or mini album. This is his first release after getting out of his military service, and boy can you tell, he's got some shit to say. His music video, baby, it's iconic. And then there's a Taiwanese movie on Netflix called Marry My Dead Body that I thought would be really cheesy and ridiculous and maybe a little queerbaity. And instead, it was so moving and lovely and charming and well done. I was shocked. But it's basically about this sort of homophobic cop who, kind of against his will, has to get ghost married to the ghost of this gay guy who died in a car crash. Well, he, a hit and run, and it was, never resolved by the police. And so then this cop, he has to spend a bunch of time with this ghost and learn new things and solve this guy's murder. You'll cry at the end. I was stunned. And then, you guys, David Graeber, R.I.P., apparently had just finished his own personal book before he died, maybe with some editing left to do, called Pirate Enlightenment, or The Real Libertalia. He wrote a book about pirates, you guys! And it's his last posthumous book, and I saw it in the bookstore yesterday, and I scrimped. I was so excited. Because it's pirates and David Graeber from above. He was looking from on high and was like, here, Julia, have a book about pirates from me.
XOXO, David Graeber.
Anyway, how about you?
I don't know. Usually we have recommendations of things we're reading and watching and listening to. And these are truly just little tiny things bringing me joy.
And you've been very sickly.
Yes. I'm getting over being sick. With allergies, ? Not sure what's happening, but my body is not doing 100%. So I've been drinking a lot of tea. I've been really back into Earl Grey tea these days. Like, breakfast, black tea, whatever people call it. Can just go and, like, sit in a sad corner. Like, who needs that?
Yeah.
Earl Grey all day. Lady Grey, if you have it, that's cute too. I got some jeans from Madewell. I don't know if I talked about these on the podcast, but like...
I love Madewell jeans. You converted me to Madewell jeans, actually.
I know, because it's like for, like, who need like the curvy shape of jeans. So you don't have the gap in the waist, but it doesn't like squeeze your thighs and butt. Madewell has great curvy pants. My only complaint is that they have like 17 styles for like non-curvy. I had like 2 at a time for like the curvy. So you just gotta get what you get and you walk out happy that you have pants that fit you. But I've been like living in these. I'm on a trip right now and these are like the only pants I brought. But I got a pretty bad stain on them the other day and I almost cried.
Oh no.
And I was like, no. And I got one of those like OxyClean Max Clean whatever sticks. I did like 3 washes and got the stain out. And so like, God bless OxyClean. But the moment when you realize like your favorite jeans are like potentially ruined forever. And I'd only had these like maybe a month. Like I haven't gotten them that long ago.
Oh no.
Vern's like, you just get another pair. I'm like, you don't understand. I am emotionally attached to this pair. Also, they're not cheap. I don't want to go buy another pair after a month of having these.
The relationship between a girl and her favorite pair of jeans is an unbreakable bond.
Yeah.
That truly foundational to your well-being at any given time.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support, our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.